Hello, I'm Roongroj Bhidayasiri. In the next 30 minutes, I'm assigned a very important topic on how digital technologies impact our clinical practice. And I will try to convince you all virtually on certain perspective that we can utilize different types of technologies to benefit our work and patients. I hope that next year I'll have the opportunity to meet you all in person. Here are my disclosure. I'm going to reference some of the discussion to our work related to tremor and nocturnal monitoring devices. I'm also very grateful to all patients who have given their consent for using their videos in this lecture for educational purposes. Let's first ask ourselves where the technologies, which also include artificial intelligence, can best fit our practice. This model in front of you illustrates the process of clinical reasoning when we evaluate patients. We aggregate the findings as we listen to patients, select characteristic features from examination, generation of the list, pruning it, and finally ended by narrowing down the differential diagnosis and to be proved by investigations. Where do you think technologies can best fit in this process? Let's put a case example to test this model and we work it through together. A patient presented to you on the left at point A with a constellation of motor and non-motor symptoms. Some of them are non-specific. As a neurologist, we listen to these symptoms and work through the possibility in the form of the funnel, quickly moving from this overwhelming fact from point A to B based on our clinical experience and instinct. The shrinking diameter of the funnel reflects narrowing down of possibilities with acquisition of new information. Then we extract the pivot feature based on pertinent history of parasomnia and family history of Parkinson disease and clinical findings of left-hand tremor, generating the possibility at point B. At this point, digital technologies will have a role to augment our clinical reasoning in confirming the feature, for example, objective characteristic of tremor and bradykinesia, and further provide objective quantification of treatment response based on finger tapping, gait dynamics, and potential risk associated with future treatments. So in clinical practice, where we approach individual patients, listening to patients always come first, and we have to exercise our clinical reasoning to identify what information we can better use to determine the diagnosis of the patients. We decide what outcome to be measured, and we ask the machine to do the work for us. What about patient views on digital technologies? So far, their impression has been quite positive. Patients are eager to explore how digital technologies would help them in the daily management of complexities of symptoms, tracking them in response to treatment, and would like to have a digital platform for interacting with healthcare professionals, also for finding information, knowledge, and support. I don't think that we are going to run out of options on devices. Devices increased exponentially in recent years, and by far the majority of devices are accelerometer. However, there are other types of devices for consideration. Very much depends on what outcome we would like to monitor. For example, gyroscope, which is good for measuring angular velocity, and we use this device for monitoring patients' ability to turn in bed. Very small sensor, like fingernail sensor, may be good for evaluating dexterity, or spectrometer that can be used to identify food composition for patients with dysphagia. With this device, it will give us outcomes, and ideally it should not be a single outcome, but rather a set of selected patient-centered digital outcome measures. Look at this example that utilized smartphone in a 6-month phase 1 clinical trial in which participants were required to complete 6 daily motor active tests like finger tapping and sustained phonation. then carry the smartphone during the day as passive monitoring like walking. Adherence was found to be acceptable, with all active and passive features significantly differentiating Parkinson's disease from control subjects, and also with good correlation with standard rating scales. With advances of technologies, we have devices that can monitor almost any physiomes or phenotype of interest. However, I still like to quote in the old days that still remind me that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts to be counted. In the field of Parkinson's disease, we still lack quantitative biomarkers to diagnose and follow its progression as well as respond to treatment. Although we can measure almost everything, we would like to use digital devices to keep outcomes that truly matter to patients. So we have the tools and we know the process. Next, in my view, is a hard part, which is how to integrate the monitoring data with various functioning, preferably in a free living environment. And this is a concept of deep phenotyping. Deep phenotyping becomes essential in this setting as it shows different dimensions of the disease and leverage all available data sources by using various algorithms to gather details specific to the individual that describing the details of the disease. There are 4 general principles for deep clinical phenotyping. Begin with clinical history and examination, using sensor or other tools to provide measurements of the individuals. Multiple domains are assessed. And finally, these assessments are extended to real-world settings like the home of the patients. Clinical phenotyping relies primarily on history and physical examination. While valuable, these features are episodic and categorical, leaving gaps in our understanding of Parkinson's disease phenotype. Deep phenotyping is a new concept that provides a comprehensive assessment of a condition in the multiple clinical, biological, genetic, imaging, and sensor-based tools. And this approach is reflected well in this figure I borrowed from the anniversary essay winner this year in Lancet Neurology. So congratulations to our colleague, Alberto Aspe. Let's look at how digital technologies can improve our diagnostic ability. May I take you back to the scenario of Michael J. Fox to illustrate some challenges we had with the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. Lucky Man was the first book I read when I developed interest in movement disorders. Let me read some part to you when he described how his symptoms developed. In chapter 1, he described his symptom like this. I worked up to find the message in my left hand. It had me trembling. It wasn't a fax, telegram, memo, or the unusual sort of missive bringing disturbing news. In fact, my hand held nothing at all. The trembling was the message. It was over 30 years ago in 1990, and he noted the intermittent nature of his symptoms, although persistent in the following months. Now comes the important part about the clinical assessment in 1990, that rely mostly on episodic clinical examination that we nowadays realize that is not optimal, especially in the early stage of Parkinson's disease, where symptoms can be intermittent and subtle. Indeed, it took more than a year until September 1991 when the diagnosis of young onset Parkinson's disease was confirmed in his case. I think his case provides a very good example that we're still facing today, the diagnostic challenges of early Parkinson's disease, demonstrating here in this study that the accuracy has not really improved in the last 25 years. And this can be due to many reasons and circumstances, including episodic subtle and non-specific symptoms in patients during the early stage. Moreover, there are no specific biomarkers that can help us with the diagnosis of early Parkinson's disease. In fact, experienced neurologists diagnose Parkinson's disease not just by clinical criteria, but on a method of pattern recognition. So my question is how we can incorporate digital technologies in assisting us with the diagnosis. If we come back to the funnel model again, we'll probably get a better answer in what situation technologies will be useful in the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. If we estimate the core knowledge of Parkinson's disease involve 1 million facts or data points, any AI system must sift through 1 million facts at the y-end before moving toward point B. At this y-end, the AI is likely to encounter the huge amount of data that may not always follow the classical computer logic of true and false. And this is really a limiting factor seen in most AI systems. On the other hand, a seasoned neurologist can quickly move from this overwhelming fact from point A to B based on his or her clinical experience, pattern recognition, and instinct. Then, when characteristic features have been identified at point B, AI can have a role to assist neurologists with the digital assessment tools. Like in the case of Michael J. Fox, this could be identifying objective tremor characteristics or quantifying subtle tremor in the early morning. Nowadays, we have choices of devices I mentioned before to objectively quantify symptoms of interest. The list shown here focuses on those devices with technology readiness level of 8 to 9, meaning that its utility has been tested in clinical practice environment. If we focus on tremor analysis, several algorithms have been shown to be sensitive to differentiate Parkinson's disease tremor from its mimics. On the left, showing our own device with tremor fluctuations index as a differentiating marker between Parkinson's disease and essential tremor. And on the right, another system utilizing smartphone using relative energy as a discriminating feature between the two disorders. Devices are certainly good when we know what we want to measure at point B, which is reflected in this example, showing a combined set of digital outcomes on voice, gait, balance, tapping, and so on that can differentiate among those with early Parkinson's disease, idiopathic REM behavior disorders, and control subjects. Instead of using multi-domain assessment like in the previous example, this study went deeper into voice analysis, exploring various acoustic domains, not limited to phonation, and also prosody, fluency, and rhythm for differentiating purposes. This diagram provides a more complete picture of what we would like to see patients engaging in a health system whereby clinical data and biological samples derived from routine clinical care are aggregated to support innovation and improvement in diagnosis. Data and samples can be collected across visits, accumulating over time for individual patients. The field of data science has advanced rapidly, with possibility to screen large populations for those with Parkinson's disease. While the results are promising, large clinical validations are still needed. I have two examples to share with you. The first on de-phenotyping of voice as a potential diagnostic biomarker. By analyzing a database of Parkinson's disease patients and non-Parkinson's subjects containing voice recording to extract paralinguistic feature, serving as input to machine learning models for early diagnosis and predict Parkinson's disease severity. Another example, collected tapping behaviors actively or passively on smartphone. With a deep learning approach, objective feature of fine motor impairment can be extracted from finger tapping for the purpose of screening a large population for early Parkinson's disease, as shown in the right top figure, or for differentiating the severity of Parkinson's disease, as shown in the right bottom figure. Nowadays, there are several systems for monitoring symptoms of Parkinson's disease. This slide provides the example of the early work on continuous automated assessment of on-off fluctuations, demonstrating mild to moderate agreement between bradykinesia and dyskinesia scores and patient's diary. As shown in our application, the result can be further interpreted into various types of on-off fluctuations in relation to medication intake, like wearing off or delay on, making it more practical for both patients and doctors to work together on medication adjustment. Data from variables on a set of motor outcomes can be fed back to clinicians, so adjusting dopaminergic medications can be implemented remotely, resulting in better symptom control in the experimental group, as you can see in this study. This approach can potentially replace traditional patient's diary, in which patients collected their on-off symptoms while waiting to see doctors in the next face-to-face visit. Our group also utilized a set of digital outcomes showing here on the example of finger tapping to determine the optimal dosage of apomorphine infusion during the titration, resulting in significant improvement of several motor and non-motor domains. Moreover, optimal dosage can be identified significantly faster when compared to traditional titration. Monitoring nowadays can also be applied to non-motor symptoms, like showing in this study from our fellow, demonstrating an improvement of orthostatic hypotension in the early morning in those patients who slept in a lateral position. However, I must say that on and off are two artificial states and do not truly represent patients' daily function. It would be ideal to be able to monitor patients' daily function in their own environment. A different environment like in clinic or free living can influence monitoring outcomes. As you can see in this slide, in supervised setting like in clinic, we tend to measure patients' capacity, reflecting their maximum performance. Outside, we get the patient's usual performance, which can be different from the capacity, even though patients were performing the same task. As shown in the pink box you see up in the slide, patients walk slower when they are at home, but faster in our clinic. And they think this is a good example. What I have just said emphasizes the importance of getting a real-world data. As recognized by the FDA, that it can come from a number of sources, as you see in the figure. Varied real-world data will become real-world evidence, which certainly has enormous applications in the fields of Parkinson's disease. This study provides an example that how we can obtain varied real-world data from remote assessment of multiple objective measures that are combined to a mobile Parkinson's disease score, which is a summary measure of severity of Parkinson's motor feature collected by a smartphone-based application. This type of assessment can give a rapid, remote, frequent, and objective assessment, which could inform care decisions and allow for more patients with Parkinson's disease to take part in the remote clinical trials. This is another example that uses a smartphone as a monitoring device to collect daily motor tasks to represent patient-centered digital outcome measures. It demonstrated good adherence of all active features like finger tappings and passive features like walking, sit to stand, and this feature can differentiate Parkinson's disease from control subjects. Indeed, a recent review has highlighted advances of research in measuring free living symptoms and activity outcomes in the home or home-like environments. Common measures are shown in the left column, but studies were still limited by the number of participants and duration of monitoring. However, this approach could be very helpful and really help us to identify what outcomes are relevant to patient functional status and quality of life. And this approach is likely to be appreciated by many patients. Showing here one of the pioneers, Sarah Rickere. who is an expert of her own illness of Parkinson's disease. She initiated self-tracking of her symptoms as a project of her PhD thesis. Her recent work from this survey provided the evidence that many patients would like to monitor their symptoms and functions that eventually helped them to understand their disease better. Importantly, it will help us as doctors to understand symptom and function individuality, leading the way to a shared decision-making for individualized treatment. In my opinion, monitoring functional activities are more challenging than on-off symptoms. But first, we need to understand what activities matter to elderly and Parkinson's disease patients. This survey, organized by the World Health Organization, aimed to prioritize what functional activities would be targeted for assistive devices amongst the elderly. Activity involving eating and drinking, and transferring to and from bed or chair are the two most important functional activities rated by elderly individuals as the most challenging tasks. Specifically to Parkinson's disease, many daily functions are included as patient-reported outcome measure, as defined by the International Consortium for Health Outcome Measurement, with 5 core sets of outcomes that matter to patients. And these include motor symptoms, non-motor symptoms, ability to work, Parkinson's disease-related health status, and hospital admissions. However, these outcomes, for example, eating tasks, are still far from being developed into digital measure and validated in a free living environment. A lack of digital measure of these daily functions prompts us to become interested in some of these tasks, as highlighted in the pink box, including turning in bed and getting out of bed as the 2 main daily functions that are of interest to our group. Look at this example. We use a set of sensors to develop a set of patient-centered digital outcome measures to demonstrate the ability to turn in bed in Parkinson's disease patients, and utilize this outcome in the therapeutic clinical trial to demonstrate the objective improvement of turning in bed ability. The video demonstrated one subject with nocturnal hypokinesia, and a comparison of sensor signals that you see on the right, showing how the signals improve with a therapeutic intervention. Another study, which is more recent, is to develop objective outcome of getting out of bed that are inclusive of kinematic parameters and patterns of movement. And we hope that this outcome can be tested in future clinical trials with regard to nocturia and early morning akinesia in patients with Parkinson's disease. What to measure is first step proposed in the roadmap of implementation of patient-centered digital outcome measures. This review nicely highlighted the importance of monitoring clinical actionable phenotypes, referring to measures that can be used for clinical decision-making. Several target symptoms of function has been identified, as you see in the table in the right side here, that is identified from the Fox Insight projects that include 4 motor and 6 non-motor symptoms that were identified as patient-relevant targets from machine learning approach. Devices nowadays can be included in a treatment package. Let me share a few examples to you. The first example is a surge of interest in the use of application for managing Parkinson's disease. When utilized properly, Parkinson's disease management applications can provide various benefits to patients, ranging from not only monitoring symptoms that I mentioned earlier, but it can deliver new services, being a source of education, and many more. The application on smartphone can also include the algorithm that magnifies subtle movement for remote analysis, like showing here the examples of remote amplification of hand tremor. Pose estimation is also a new technique that can be applied for remote assessment of gait, balance, and posture. With the example I show you here, demonstrated the utility of 2D video-based tracking in the evaluation of gait and measuring treatment response in Parkinson's disease patients. And this is probably not a new example at all. And nowadays, there are many telehealth applications that have been used in the field of rehabilitation. As shown in this recent systematic review, that it provides benefits in gait, balance, speech, swallowing training, and various other symptom domains in Parkinson's disease. So it seems that the pandemic has accelerated the development of teletechnologies, allowing us to better observe the evolvement of symptoms over time and conduct less frequent visits to specialists and facilitate care, especially in the rural areas. A variety of systems with different strengths and shortcomings have been investigated, and I probably cannot mention all. The future of telehealth should be multimodal, targeting video visits, smartphone application, camera, and variables or even non-variable devices. The last few slides are to provide some example on what our sensor and gadget can be utilized as part of assistive devices. This recent systematic review provides some examples on those devices for tremor where sensors were embedded for automatic detection of tremor. This example of gyroscopic spoon, which use a microchip and sensor to detect the force and direction of the hand tremor, then move in the opposite direction to counteract the shaking. However, objective eating outcome with this device has not been demonstrated in the publication you see here, and which can be due to a small number of subjects. Another example from our group utilized sensor in the tremor growth to automatically detect tremor and at the same time provide electrical muscle stimulation on demand with efficacy demonstrated in a sham-controlled clinical trial in Parkinson's disease patients with intractable hand tremor. And what is really happening now and more in the future is the integration of virtual reality into medicine. With a recent example from the Cleveland Clinic using a VR platform to understand and better treat freezing of gait in Parkinson's disease patients. I'm surely that we're going to see many more samples of this in the near future. The last example, which I think is very neat, providing a home-based personalized video self-modeling intervention delivered via virtual reality head-mounted display to reduce freezing of gait. A physiotherapist assesses the participants in their homes to identify person-specific triggers of freezing and develop individualized movement strategy to overcome freezing episodes. Participants watch their video using a virtual reality display, followed by a physical practice their strategy in their own home. Look at this example. It's very neat, isn't it? So I hope that I can convince you that technologies are already at our door, but it is not going to replace clinical reasoning. And we should embrace technologies in what we could see in 4 areas in clinical practice. Technology could be used as our assistant for basic and time-consuming tasks, so we have more time with our patients. Technologies can be used as our monitor with many examples that I have mentioned, or the coach, so that we can get real-time feedback on important information for clinical decision-making. And lastly, as a teammate, the patient-centered digital outcome measures were identified, leading the way for shared decision-making and ultimately individualized treatment for our patients. And I would like to thank you all for the attention. Thank you.